The Bronze Age collapse. Why did highly advanced civilizations vanish overnight 3,000 years ago? Welcome to Deep Sight. I'm your time navigator, Lawrence Stardust. In our previous episodes, we talked about the origins of human races. I believe you now understand how significant this is for grasping human history. The trajectory of history is inseparable from the evolution of peoples and the divergence of civilizations. Once you understand human origins and the historical development of different ethnic groups, you can make sense of today's complex social relations, the rivalries between nations, the clashes and fusions of cultures, and even the deep-seated prejudices we hold against the other. All of these can be traced back thousands of years to gene flow, climate change, and the rise and fall of empires. That is why the deepest lessons of history often lie beyond the events themselves. Today, we begin with a staggering collapse that happened 3,000 years ago to see how humanity fell into the abyss when globalization broke down for the first time. But before we dive into the details of the collapse, we need to answer a more fundamental question. How did the Bronze Age itself come about? And what profound effects did it have on human society? Only by understanding how the Bronze Age was built can we truly grasp why it fell apart. The origin of the Bronze Age and its social revolution. Let's turn the clock back several thousand years. Before bronze appeared, humans had been using stone tools for over 1,000,000 years. In the late Neolithic, people occasionally picked up nuggets of natural copper, that reddish metal that could be hammered into small beads or knives. But this raw copper was too soft, even less sharp than obsidian, so it was only used for ornaments. It could not replace the stone axe. The real breakthrough came around 3,500 BCE in Mesopotamia. There, craftsmen made a marvelous discovery. When they smelted copper ore together with tin ore, the resulting new material was much harder than pure copper and had a lower melting point. That was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, with an optimal ratio of about 10 parts copper to 1 part tin. Why was this formula so important? Pure copper melts at 1,083 degrees Celsius, requiring very advanced furnaces. Adding tin lowered the melting point to around 800 degrees Celsius, achievable with a simple pottery kiln and bellows. A lower threshold meant more people could master the technology, and the greater hardness meant it could be made into unprecedentedly sharp weapons and durable tools. Thus, a dividing line was drawn in human history. The hundreds of thousands of years before belonged to the Stone Age. The following 2,000 years would be called the Bronze Age. But bronze was not just a new material. It was like a boulder thrown into the pond of human society, sending ripples through politics, economics, warfare, and culture. In terms of power structure, producing bronze required copper and tin. Copper ores were relatively common, but tin was extremely rare, mainly found in Central Asia, Eastern Anatolia, and as far away as the British Isles. That meant every Bronze Age civilization depended on long-distance trade. Whoever controlled the mines and the trade routes controlled weapons and wealth. So early chiefdoms rapidly evolved into centralized kingdoms. Rulers monopolized bronze production and distribution, using it to cast ritual vessels and ceremonial objects that symbolized royal power. The 9 tripods of China's Shang and Zhou dynasties are the classic example. Not weapons, but sacred symbols of establishing the realm. In economics and warfare, bronze axes and sickles gave agriculture truly efficient tools for the first time. Northern Europe was once covered by dense forest. A few swings of a bronze axe could fell a huge tree, opening up vast lands for cultivation and soaring grain production. At the same time, professional armies equipped with bronze spearheads, armor, and chariots had an overwhelming advantage over tribes still using stone tools. Conquest and unification became possible, and the first empires in human history were born. In culture and knowledge, to manage increasingly complex trade and taxation, the first writing systems emerged: cuneiform, hieroglyphs, linear B, all products of the Bronze Age. Metallurgy itself was an early science, requiring mineral identification, proportion calculation, and furnace temperature control, all of which greatly stimulated abstract thinking and logical reasoning. In other words, the Bronze Age changed not only human tools, but also the human mind. The peak of ancient globalization. Now, let us turn our gaze to the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, 3,000 years ago. It was an era of ancient globalization that would astonish later generations. The Egyptian 19th dynasty was building the temples of Abu Simbel. Ramesses II signed the first recorded peace treaty in human history, the famous Silver Treaty with the Hittite Empire. The Hittites had already mastered iron smelting, though it had not yet replaced bronze. The Mycenaean Greeks built enormous beehive tombs and the Lion Gate. Their pottery was exported as far as Sardinia and the Levant. Cyprus was a copper mining center, sending hundreds of tons of copper ingots to Egypt and Ugarit every year. The Phoenician port of Byblos had maintained trade with Greece and Crete for centuries. The city of Ugarit possessed a vast library of clay tablets inscribed in 7 different writing systems, including one of the world's earliest alphabets. Babylonian mathematicians had already solved quadratic equations, and Assyrian craftsmen produced breathtaking ivory reliefs. Diplomatically, the Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh called each other "my brother." Their royal families intermarried and exchanged gifts of gold, doctors, and craftsmen. The Yalubaran shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey, carried goods from at least 7 different cultures: Cypriot copper ingots, Syrian glass, Canaanite pottery, Egyptian golden scarabs, Baltic amber, African ivory, and even a ceremonial mace from Italy. This ship makes it clear that the Mediterranean was already a busy international waterway. Palaces were piled high with luxuries from distant lands. Palace economies were highly developed. Mycenaean tablets record complex taxation, rationing, and labor allocation. Some cities reached populations of 30,000, a supercity 3,000 years ago. They had sewers, baths, huge granaries, professional armies, chariot workshops, and a full-time scribal class. This was a sophisticated society with diplomacy, logistics, industrial production, scientific knowledge, and literary records. And all of this, every palace, every fleet, every writing system, every diplomatic archive, was reduced to ashes within just a few decades, within 1 or 2 generations. Cities were abandoned, empires evaporated. The speed and completeness of this collapse are extremely rare in world history. Entering the mystery of the collapse. We like to think our own global civilization is indestructible. But 3,000 years ago, a highly integrated geopolitical network discovered just how fragile certainty really is. From the Mycenaean palaces to the Hittite stronghold of Hattusa, the lineage of the ancient world was severed by a perfect storm of environmental pressures, migratory upheavals, and hidden vulnerabilities. And a great drought that lasted more than 150 years became the trigger that detonated the entire system. Archaeologist Eric Klein has pinned the key year of the collapse to 1177 BCE, when the Sea Peoples invaded Egypt and were repelled. But that year is only a symbolic full stop. The collapse had begun decades, or even a century earlier. Puzzle: the Ugarit tablets. Today, I want to leave you with a puzzle. Imagine you received a distress message from a lost city saying, "Enemy fleets have landed, only a few kilometers from the city," and the person who wrote that message was probably burned to death in the ruins the very same day. Would you think this was science fiction or a real event? The answer is neither. It is the final chapter of the ancient Syrian city of Ugarit. In the 1960s, archaeologists discovered an extraordinary set of clay tablets in the ruins of Ugarit. The most famous of them was written by a merchant named Ilirepe. He wrote, "The enemy has landed. Their ships appear on the sea. Our army is defeated. The city is under siege. Send reinforcements. Send chariots and infantry. The enemy has breached the walls. My city is destroyed. The whole country is exposed before the enemy. O gods, who can save us?" These words are still chilling to read today. Shortly after that message, Ugarit was completely burned and never rebuilt. Experts believe the letter was never sent. The fire had reached the gates, and the scribe perhaps wrote those last lines in despair before perishing with his city. Even more striking, archaeologists also found a charred tablet in the same ruins that recorded a solar eclipse. It seems that the local priest had warned the king that disaster would come, and soon afterward the palace was consumed by fire. The destruction of Ugarit is a microcosm of the entire Bronze Age systemic collapse. The roots of systemic fragility. So just how complex was the world before the collapse? Let us examine this so-called ancient international system. In the 13th century BCE, a supernetwork emerged in the eastern Mediterranean. Its participants included the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Babylonia, Assyria, and the Phoenician and Syrian coastal city-states, like Ugarit. Through formal diplomatic letters, the famous Amarna tablets, royal marriages, gift exchanges, and commercial treaties, they built a highly interconnected world. The name of the era reveals its core technology, bronze. As we already know, bronze requires copper and tin ore is extremely rare, having to be transported from thousands of miles away. An archaeological team from Cambridge University simulated a typical trade route of the late Bronze Age. Copper mined in Cyprus, smelted into ingots, shipped to Ugarit, then carried by overland caravans to the Hittites and Assyrians, and in return bartered for grain and timber. This network linked the tin mines of Cornwall on the Atlantic coast with the core civilizations of the Mediterranean. As one historian put it, without those thousands of kilometers of land and sea supply chains, the hegemony of the Bronze Age would not have existed. Yet it was precisely this highly interconnected, specialized, and centralized structure that sowed the seeds of systemic collapse, like an over-optimized supply chain where the failure of any single node could bring down the entire network. The domino effect and the Troy puzzle. This kind of collapse is not one pillar falling, but all pillars cracking at once. When a society becomes extremely interconnected, failure in one region quickly spreads to others. Archaeologists now generally agree that the Bronze Age collapse was a synchronous catastrophe. From the Greek mainland to Anatolia, from the Syrian coast to Canaan, nearly every city site is covered by a thick layer of burning and abandonment. A 2025 archaeological report noted that between 1250 and 1150 BCE, the rate of city destruction in the eastern Mediterranean reached an astonishing 90% or more. There is another puzzle that is more familiar to everyone. Was the Trojan War real history or a myth invented by Homer? And if the war did happen, how was Troy actually destroyed? For over a century, archaeologists have excavated at least 9 Troys layered on top of each other at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. The most critical layers are Troy 6 and Troy VA. Troy 6, circa 1700 to 1300 BCE, was a magnificent city with double walls, and it yielded fine Mycenaean pottery, seemingly the great city with wide streets that Homer describes. However, the archaeological strata clearly show that Troy 6 was not destroyed by warfare, but by a powerful earthquake. There are clear seismic displacement marks in the stone foundations of the walls, and many rooms contain crushed skeletons. After the earthquake, survivors quickly rebuilt a new city on the same site, Troy VA. This layer is no longer the majestic city of kings, but rather crowded and cramped. Many people packed into large houses filled with storage jars. Walls were hastily reinforced, and gates were blocked. Archaeological strata prove that Troy VA was ultimately destroyed by a massive fire. A burning layer nearly a meter thick, with arrowheads and unburied human bones scattered in the rubble. The destruction of Troy VA occurred around 1220 to 1180 BCE, roughly coinciding with the time described in Homer's epics for the Greek expedition against Troy. But here is the problem. When Troy VA was burned, Mycenaean Greece itself was on the verge of collapse. Many Mycenaean city-states were struggling to survive and could hardly have organized a large-scale overseas expedition. So who were the real destroyers of Troy? Thracians? Phrygians? Or one of those mysterious sea peoples? The debate among archaeologists continues. Yet scholars are almost certain that these real earthquakes and fires, passed down through oral tradition for 400 years, were eventually woven into that magnificent epic narrative. The sea peoples, cause or symptom. Now let us talk about the most mysterious invaders of all, the sea peoples. Egyptian records describe them in detail. They are called the Peleset, Shikalesh, Denyen, Weshish. Archaeologists speculate that the Peleset, Philistines, were probably migrants from the Mycenaean Greek peninsula, part of the Sea People's migration. They occupied a strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, roughly today's Gaza Strip. The Greeks therefore called that area Palestin, land of the Philistines, the origin of the name Palestine. Interestingly, in the Old Testament the Philistines are depicted as the archenemies of Samson, but archaeological excavations of Philistine settlements are filled with Aegean pottery, looms, and architectural styles. They were not barbarians, but a migrant group with advanced technology and culture. In other words, that great wave of migration sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean was, in a sense, also a transfer of civilization. At a 2025 archaeology conference, new DNA studies on the Sea Peoples sparked heated debate. Did the Philistines come from Crete, Cyprus, or Western Anatolia? The latest ancient DNA analysis shows their ancestry is quite complex, more like sons of the sea, with mixed origins across the Aegean. If you try to picture a Mediterranean port around 1200 BCE, you might see this. Ragged flotillas crowded with men, women, and children, fleeing their burned homelands, desperately looking for new land to farm, while also plundering for food. A mixture of climate refugees and invaders, inseparable. Modern scholars increasingly agree. The Sea Peoples were not a single foreign enemy, but a symptom of chaos. They were a mix of climate refugees, displaced peasants, fugitive warriors, mercenaries, and pirates. They appeared because the old palace system had already collapsed and could no longer provide food or work. They were both the destroyers and the refugees of destruction. Besides foreign enemies, there was also internal revolt. Archaeologists have found unusual records in the Mycenaean palace tablets at Pylos. Local officials began hoarding wheat and refusing to deliver bronze to the center. Palace guards had their rations cut. There is even a record of potters on strike. A desperate line in Hittite texts reads, "Now the granaries are empty, the people eat earth." So the collapse was not a single invasion, but an implosion from external pressure to internal disintegration. The Great Drought, the last straw. Over the past decade, paleoclimatologists have extracted high-resolution data from salt caves in Israel, lake cores in Cyprus, and stalagmites in Anatolia. A 2025 multi-proxy study confirmed that after about 1225 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean suffered a mega-drought, lasting more than 150 years. Annual rainfall may have dropped by 30 to 50% for decades. Crops failed, olives and grapes died on a massive scale. Grain taxes plummeted, palace treasuries emptied. More deadly, Bronze Age cities did not rely on local rainfall for irrigation but on complex terraces, drainage channels, and reservoir systems, all requiring centralized maintenance. Once the drought lasted more than 2 years, the irrigation systems salinized or collapsed. Repairing them would take years of labor and resources, but those resources were already exhausted. No grain, no taxes, no taxes, no army, and even the highest walls were hollow shells. The last Hittite kings lamented on tablets, "We have no grain for our soldiers. The enemy is coming, and the land is silent." Remember the blackened tablet from Ugarit? Its final line read, "The enemy has landed. Who can save us?" Written while starving and without reinforcements. The drought also forced desperate people to move in large numbers. Archaeologists have found many temporary campsites in northern Syria, crude huts, the bones of slaughtered livestock, hurried burials with no grave goods. These were the earliest climate refugees. They moved from inland to the coast, from mountains to river valleys. When they found that their destinations had also been abandoned, they turned into looters. The fleets of the Sea Peoples were probably filled with women, children, and shepherds, not professional soldiers in armor. There is an even more striking detail. A Hittite king wrote to Assyria begging for grain. "Please send me grain. My land is eating grass." Another king even threatened the gods in prayer. "If you do not send rain, I will abandon my kingdom." Such desperate pleas are almost unheard of in other Bronze Age texts. This extreme survival crisis made the Hittite Empire the first of the great powers to collapse entirely. Cultural rupture and the dawn of iron. The cruelest consequence of the Bronze Age collapse was not the destruction of material things, but the break in culture. Mycenaean linear B script existed only on palace tablets, used for accounting. When the palaces burned, the scribes died or fled, and the writing system was permanently lost. Greece then entered a dark age, lasting 300 years, with no written evidence at all. Not until the Phoenician alphabet was introduced in the 8th century BCE did the Greeks again possess writing. But by then they had completely forgotten that their ancestors had once written in Linear B. Hittite hieroglyphic and cuneiform scripts also vanished. At Ugarit, one of the earliest alphabets had appeared, a pure alphabetic system of only 30 signs, a kind of ancient, quick input system. But with the disappearance of schools and scribes, that script quickly faded away. Egypt survived, but its power was so weakened that it could no longer export cultural influence abroad. Yet after the collapse, humanity did not sink forever. They found a new way out: iron. In fact, during the Late Bronze Age, iron was still a rare precious metal. Meteoric iron falling from the sky was rarer than gold. But when long-distance trade broke down and tin could no longer be delivered, the survivors discovered that iron ore is almost everywhere. Iron concretions in marshes, iron sand in riverbeds, limonite on hillsides. You could dig it up practically anywhere. Moreover, iron smelting required no complex recipe. Just ore and charcoal in a furnace heated to over 1,000 degrees Celsius produced a spongy iron bloom. With repeated forging, you could make tools. Early iron was not of good quality. Its hardness was even lower than that of bronze. But iron had one advantage that bronze could never match. It was cheap and everywhere. A blacksmith could dig a furnace next to the ruins and produce spearheads and sickles. Ordinary farmers could now afford metal weapons. That was a revolutionary change. How iron spawned citizen armies and changed warfare. In the Bronze Age, warfare was a game for aristocrats. A chariot and a full set of bronze armor cost the equivalent of decades of a common farmer's income. Only a small elite could afford them. Battles were heroic duels and chariot charges, like Achilles fighting Hector one-on-one in the Homeric epics. The Iron Age completely broke that monopoly. When most free farmers could afford an iron sword and an iron shield, military organization had to change. Aristocratic chariots were no match for dense infantry phalanxes. So a new kind of army was born, the citizen militia. The hoplites of ancient Greece are the best example. They came from ordinary citizen families, buying their own iron breastplates, greaves, round shields, and spears. They formed a tight phalanx, shield against shield, with spears protruding from the gaps, like a metal hedgehog advancing. This formation relied not on individual martial skill, but on discipline and cooperation. If any soldier turned and ran, the whole phalanx would be exposed. That, in turn, reinforced a sense of civic duty. If you fight for your city, you have the right to participate in its politics. The citizen armies of the Iron Age directly linked military obligation with citizen rights. The later Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legions were built on this foundation. Roman soldiers were called engineers who carry weapons, because with iron shovels, picks, and axes they could build bridges and fortifications on the march. Warfare changed from a 1 or 2 day decisive battle into a systemic, multi-year attrition. Army sizes expanded from a few hundred to tens of thousands. None of this would have been possible without the spread of iron. More importantly, iron weapons gave commoners leverage to bargain with aristocrats. The democracy of the Greek city-states and the citizen assemblies of the Roman Republic had as their military basis the self-equipped citizen soldier. Aristotle once said that the more hoplites a city-state has, the more democratic it is. That gets to the heart of the matter. So the rise of iron was not just a change of metal for tools. It was a profound social reorganization. From aristocratic chariots to citizen phalanxes, from heroic duels to disciplined coordination, from palace monopoly to citizen rights. Rebirth from the ashes. Now we can return to the story after the collapse. For 300 years after 1177 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean became a wilderness dotted with small villages, smithies, and cemeteries. The once glorious palaces were forgotten, and linear B became a dead script. But those who survived did not give up. They learned to use iron. They abandoned the centralized palace economy and turned to decentralized, village-based iron production. They no longer built giant palaces, but instead built civic squares and temples. They wrote epics and law codes with alphabets that were much simpler than linear B, so ordinary people could learn them. By the 8th century BCE, new civilizations rose from the ashes. The Phoenicians, the Greek city-states, Phrygia, Lydia, Israel, and the Kingdom of Judah. They no longer used bronze chariots, but sailed in iron-built triremes. Their armies were not aristocratic war chariot corps, but citizen phalanxes armed with iron weapons. It was these citizen soldiers who stopped the Persian hordes at Marathon and destroyed the Persian fleet at Salamis, ultimately pushing ancient Greek civilization to its zenith. Modern echoes and conclusion. Finally, let us return to the present. The Bronze Age collapse leaves us with its most chilling warning. When a system becomes too complex, too dependent on long-distance supply chains, and too centralized in power, a seemingly small shock can trigger a cascading collapse. Today's global supply chain is strikingly similar to the Bronze Age trade network. Our computer chips depend on a few fabs in Taiwan and South Korea. Energy pipelines run through war zones. Grain supplies rely on Black Sea ports. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of just-in-time supply chains. A single cargo ship stuck in the Suez Canal could shut down auto factories around the world. And the current US-Iran war has shown that a few warships can cut off oil supplies and send prices soaring. If a Bronze Age Mediterranean merchant heard this news, he would surely smile bitterly. because he had gone through the same deadly chain of tin supply, cut weapon shortage, border lost. It makes you wonder, after thousands of years, has civilization really advanced that much? On the climate front, the latest data from 2025 to 2026 show that the Eastern Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa are once again facing severe drought. Agricultural failure in Syria, Iraq, and Ethiopia has already triggered new waves of mass migration. Europe's reaction resembles that of the Hittite Empire 3,000 years ago, closing borders and Egypt building walls. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. Our power grids, internet, and financial systems are all highly interconnected. A single solar storm or a single software update error could paralyze entire systems for days. A Bronze Age palace needed months to rebuild grain reserves. We would lose almost all digital records after just 3 days of blackout. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this: complexity does not guarantee permanence. The palaces of the Bronze Age flourished for 15 centuries, 7 times longer than the United States has existed, yet they fell within a single generation. What reason do we have to think our own civilization is immune to such a fate? This is not a call to fatalism, but a reminder that true resilience lies not in building higher walls, but in maintaining adaptability. The Iron Age was able to rise from the ashes precisely because the survivors abandoned the centralized palace economy and turned to dispersed, village-based iron production. They lost writing and monumental architecture, but they kept their agricultural knowledge and survival skills. The challenge we face today is not to go back to a dark age, but to retain the benefits of globalization while injecting more redundancy, localization, and diversity. The Bronze Age world failed to do that. It over-optimized and had no backup plan. When you turn off this video, take a look at how many parts of your phone come from different countries. Think about how many days of food reserves your city has. Then ask yourself, if the global supply chain were to break down for 1 year tomorrow, would your society also leave behind a layer of unburied ashes, like Uber Eats? If you enjoyed this comprehensive deep dive, from archaeology and materials to social structures and modern lessons, please like, subscribe, and share. By studying others, we understand ourselves. By studying history, we understand the rise and fall of nations. See you next time.